Chris, ready?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. This webinar is brought to you by Green Minds, a citywide movement to find innovative nature-based solutions to solve environmental challenges and give nature a voice. I'd like to welcome you this evening. My name's Chris Avent. I'm the Green Estate Manager for Plymouth City Council. A few points of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared after the event. We have an introduction followed by an inspiring speaker that I'll introduce shortly, and after that we'll have a Q&A session. Please post any questions that you have in the Q&A function on this webinar. First of all, an introduction to Green Minds. Before I hand over to our first speaker, a brief introduction. It's a 3-year programme which will test a systems approach to delivering nature-based solutions in Plymouth. We want to put nature at the heart of our decision making, to fundamentally challenge our existing attitudes and behaviours that we are independent from nature and create green mindsets. This includes delivering on-the-ground projects such as beaver introduction, rewilding urban green spaces, tree planting, and introducing wildlife ponds to manage drainage solutions, experimenting with different delivery and management approaches to support community stewardship and green enterprise, using science and creative digital tools, including a 3D immersive film to make everyday nature visible, bringing it to life for more people, and evaluating our impact and sharing our learning through action research studies and providing new resources and tools. We can do this because we've got some really great partners on board, led by Plymouth City Council, together with Real Ideas, the University of Plymouth, Devon Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, Plymouth College of Arts and the Data Place. And this is different. We were the only UK city to secure funding from the European Regional Development Fund's Urban Innovation Actions on this theme last year. At the end of the webinar, we'll share some links where you can find out more information and get involved. Back to today's webinar. Insects make the world go round, pollinating and recycling, managing the soil, preventing any one species dominating and becoming a pest, and a food source themselves for many large animals. Insects are in decline, rapid decline, due to the way that we choose to live. But we know that insect populations can recover swiftly with a little help and space. I'm delighted to introduce Councillor Dan, who's Plymouth City Council's portfolio holder for environment and street scene, who will be followed by Ed Parr-Ferris, who's Conservation Manager at Devon Wildlife Trust, to share their campaign on action for insects and actions we can all take to restore insect populations. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome everybody on this dark, wintry evening. It's a real pleasure just to be able to introduce this session. We keep talking about insects, and it is really, really important that what everybody does and what we do at home can make a big difference, not just for the city, but also nationally. And I think Plymouth has a unique place really, because we have so much green space within our city, and we have all the blue space as well around the waterfront, that we can actually encourage quite a few large numbers of new species of insects. This year, we sort of used COVID actually to our advantage. Right at the very beginning of the year, we'd already decided that with through the Future Parks Accelerator programme and how we manage our green spaces, we were going to radically look at how we use our grass cutting regime to encourage more wilding of our green spaces. And with COVID, we took a big decision right at the very beginning of the year to do no mow May. And this had a really, really massive impact, because by the time the end of the year came, we cut over 1,000 less areas of grass across the city to allow more wild grasses to grow, more wild meadows, and to support the fact that we get more insects. And we're going to do more next year. So next year we're going to build on this. So we'll cut our green spaces differently, make sure we've got lovely park areas and sports areas, but also make sure that we've got lots of areas across the city and in communities that are going to be left to go wild. And we're also going to expand all our wild meadow planting as well as planting at least 1,000 trees this winter. So I think we're doing our bit to try and increase the pollinating sources across the country, across the city. I think Chris is now going to show a short wildflower film, and then it'll be over to Ed. Okay, thanks, Chris.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Ed Parr-Ferris, and I'm going to be talking to you today about action for insects. I'm not sure if my presentation has managed to dislodge itself from this, so just bear with me for one moment while I reload it. Hopefully everyone can see that now. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you about action for insects. This is a national campaign by the Wildlife Trusts. It's led by Devon Wildlife Trust, and it's about raising awareness of the decline in insects. And this evening I'm going to talk through a few of the challenges facing insects and then look at some of the things that we can all do to help insects to recover. So a little introduction to me and my family first. So this is my son Jack looking at a painted lady butterfly in our garden, landing on a scabious plant in our garden. So as a family, we've grown up around insects. I grew up around insects and living on a farm and living in the countryside. And my boys, Jack and Sam, have grown up doing much the same, whether it's out walking the lanes in South Devon, where we live, and looking at insects in the hedges or whatever, or me and my obsession with dung beetles in kicking the tops off cowpats and the likes and rummaging around in them. But we're quite unusual. We love insects, we tolerate insects, and we sort of, the boys will quite regularly go and pick up insects, even from cowpats and the likes. So pretty unusual. But what we've seen in recent decades is a sort of move towards less tolerance of insects, and it's quite often age related. Kids like Jack and Sam at their age love getting involved with insects, and they love messing about with them, picking them up, looking at them, understanding them. But we've seen a big disconnect from nature, which includes insects, and a study in 2017 gives a good example of this. It looks at how fiction books and song lyrics and things like that, film storylines, have steadily referenced less and less nature things since the 1950s, but human-oriented references have not decreased. And many papers refer to things like nature deficit disorder in society, and particularly in younger people. So much so that governments like the Scottish government are starting to recognise that they need to start rebuilding curriculum-led sort of regular outdoor learning as an entitlement for all their learners. And I think a statement like this one here from Baba Dioum, I hope I pronounced his name right, a Senegalese forestry engineer who spoke to the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation Conservation of Nature, back in 1968, and said this: in the end, we only conserve what we love, and we only love what we understand, and we only understand what we're taught. And this is really, really true for insects. most people don't even notice insects. Most people would have walked past this painted lady butterfly and never even spotted it. So how on earth could they then care about the things that it needs to survive and therefore look after it? So I'm going to show you a couple of graphs just explaining some of the state of insects and where they're at. So we'll try to limit the number of graphs in this, by the way. So I think one of the most compelling cases for insect declines is Hullman's study of flying insect biomass decline in Germany. And what that basically means is that every day a bunch of people went out and put one of these malaise traps up in a nature reserve. And at the end of the day, they weighed the amount of insect matter that they had caught and recorded that. And over 27 years, this amount declined across the various traps that were laid out across the country by 75%. That's 3/4 of the weight of insects had gone. And you should bear in mind that this was in nature reserves. So these are the best of German landscape, as it were, but you could imagine it's the very same here. And it would have been much worse in, so they're the best of the German landscape. It would have been far worse elsewhere in the landscape. Another study has shown, did a bit of a review of, I think it was 73 reports from around the world showing the declines of insects. And this chap, Sanchez Bio, found that insects, there were about over 40% of insects were threatened with extinction within the next couple of decades. And one of the things that's interesting about that is the species that were most at risk. So in land-based insects, these ones in the bottom right-hand corner here, so the Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, Hymenoptera, the wasps, bees and ants, and then the bottom right one, the dung beetles. These are all really important insect groups, and they're the most at risk groups at the minute. In the water environment, these other 4 groups here have already lost large numbers of individuals. And we're noticing that changes, so we're losing a lot of specialists, while generalists that are pollution tolerant are generally doing okay. So why does that matter? Okay, so first things, insects are everywhere. They're of the about 1.5 million species of plants, fungi and animals that we have in the world. About 1 million of them are insects. That's 2/3 of all life on Earth, barring bacteria and the likes, are insects. And of course, many mammals, reptiles, amphibians, freshwater fish, other insects are all insectivores, so they eat insects. And about 90% of the world's breeding land birds are insectivorous too. So like this spotted flycatcher here, catching a tortoise shell. And those birds eat 500 metric tons of insects a year. That's a huge amount. So if we lose 75% or 3/4 of our insects, we're not just losing these sort of things that we don't notice in our landscape. We start to lose all these other things that we really do notice in the landscape, and it can lead to catastrophic changes in the way nature works around us. And of course, that affects us in other ways as well. So insects carry out a huge number of useful things. A single ladybird can eat as many as 4,000 aphids in its 2 to 3 year life. And other species of ladybirds can eat large amounts of mildews and the like. So these are the pests that gardeners spend so much time clearing in their garden, and a ladybird just does this for its life. These other 2 on here are really interesting as well. So the carrion beetles, like this sexton beetle, the orange and black one on the left there, feed on dead animals. So like mice and birds, the things that fall to the ground and we probably don't notice, or like this door beetle in the middle here, that feeds on dung. And of course, they play a vital role in recycling things. They get rid of all the risks of having stacks of dead bodies and dung all over our world, and instead recycle these things into soil. And of course, they do much more than recycle them. In the process of digging these things into the soil, the tunnels that they create are hugely important. So they're taking these things down into the soil and burying them. So we're burying carbon into the soil, so it's storing carbon. And those holes themselves mean that air and water can get into the soil. So they do things like reducing flooding, and they ensure plants can grow. So hugely valuable things that these animals do. And of course, the most well-known thing that insects do is pollinate. So it's not just bees, but as well as hoverflies, wasps, true flies. About a quarter of all our 4,000 UK beetles are pollinators, and they're probably the world's first insect pollinators as well. And after the butterflies have finished their day shift, moths are out and about at night, and they're nocturnal pollinators, and they quite often pollinate, or they normally pollinate, strong smelling white and light coloured flowers. And the majority of our plants, I think it's about 87% of plants, rely on animals for pollination around the world. And in Britain and Europe, that's all done by insects. And from a human perspective, that has a huge impact on us as well. We've become very accustomed to a wide range of foods available throughout the year, stacking our supermarkets high with every type of fruit, veg and food stuff possible. But if we start to remove that and we lose these insect pollinated crops, we lose about 75% of our agricultural crops. And that includes all the fruit, you know, raspberries, strawberries, apples, includes things like peppers and tomatoes, but also things like coffee and chocolate. I don't know how I'd survive without coffee and chocolate, but they wouldn't be on the shelves. And while they're luxuries to some degree, it obviously have far more serious consequences than curbing our choices, affecting people's literally ability to live. So what are the causes of these insect declines? Well, I guess the single biggest one is loss of habitat. The majority of insects, and particularly pollinators, rely on species-rich habitats like these grasslands here. And humans have been dramatically altering their landscapes since Neolithic times. So first clearing woodlands and creating the sort of open habitats of grasslands, wetlands and heaths and the likes. But then since the medieval times have steadily been removing these and changing the way we manage land, mainly for food production, but also as we expand our towns and cities. And so another graph, I'm afraid, I apologise for that. But so the commonly used example of a loss of 97% of species-rich grasslands in England since the 1930s is accurate, but it does underplay the impact we've had on removing insect-friendly habitat. So that 97% is the lower yellow line there. So if you're a pollinator, there are simply far fewer flowers out there for you to feed on, which means you won't survive. So grasslands still make up about 37% of the UK land area, but semi-natural grasslands, which are the ones with more flowers in them really, make up just 1% of the UK area, and most of them are in bad condition or poor condition. And we tend to see far more fields like these in Devon, if you look around the landscape. And there are no flowers in these fields, and the species-rich hedges that would have been around these have been tightly cut, and they've been affected by other things, and so they become species poor. So there's no shelter from the hedges, there's no food in the fields or the hedges, and so we really have very few insects because of that. The next cause of insect decline is chemicals. So pesticides come in all shapes and sizes, and nearly all have an impact on insects. So obviously insecticides kill insects. The best known insecticides around there at the minute are the group called neonicotinoids, 3 of which were banned a couple of years back by the European Union because of their impact on wild pollinators. But the others are still widely used in agriculture and the likes, but they also creep into our daily life. So they're included in things like pet treatments for worms and ticks and fleas. They get everywhere, but also herbicides. So these impact insects both indirectly, obviously by removing the plants that the insects need for food and shelter, but also directly. So a study in 2016 showed that glyphosate, which is probably the one we'd all recognise most widely, has impacts for the life cycles and populations. In that particular study, it was looking at rose grain aphids, but it was the first study that really showed that herbicides have a direct impact and a mortal impact on insects. And the strength of pesticides applied in the UK continues to increase, as does the area of land treated and the number of sprays per crop. So I think we're about an average of 17 sprays per crop. And of course, that isn't talking even about things like fertilizers. So when I showed the green fields just earlier, that was really caused by fertilizers. And that's another group of chemicals that has led to quite a change in the prospects of insects. So the last few causes of insect declines then, well, I mean, one of the big ones there on the top left, we see ash dieback. So I'm using that to represent imported diseases. So as we move things around the world, we move diseases around too. And you might think, well, why am I choosing a tree species disease? Well, if you're a brown hair streak, like the one on top right there, while you might use blackthorn for your larval food plant, the plant that your caterpillars eat, as an adult, you do all your mating and feeding around mature ash trees. So the loss of these trees will probably have a big impact on species like brown hair streak, which is not dissimilar to what happened to white letter hair streak with elm. It relies on elm as its larval food plant, and their populations crashed after Dutch elm disease. Other impacts on insects come from things like climate change, so particularly around the timing of the emerging of different insects to coincide with their food plants. But also a huge number, about half of our insects are nocturnal. And so when we see sites like this, this is not a good thing for nocturnal insects. So when we see moths flying around a streetlight, they're not feeding, they're not mating. In fact, they're just whizzing round and round and round until either they die of exhaustion or they are predated by something. So it's not a great situation, but enough of the negative bad news. Don't despair, please. Unlike many of the things going on in the world, and climate change is the obvious one of them, that, where you can feel a little bit distant from how you can make a difference to it, insects do recover really quickly from low populations and the likes. And they live all around us in every space we can think of. So, you know, in our villages, towns and cities, insects have the potential to do better than in much of the wider landscape because there's a diversity of spaces offering different places for them to live and feed. Because much of this landscape is cared for as gardens or parks. And we've created an ideal place, not just for us to have as nice places to live in, but also for insects to live in. And they do thrive in surprising numbers. So I use this example from 2010 of Jennifer Owen's Leicestershire garden. And she'd studied that garden. It's quite a small garden, just an average garden. She studied it for 30 years, looking at the species within it. And I think she described over 2,600 species in that 30 years, of which just about 2,000 were insects. And she says herself that, you know, her garden is nothing special, and that she thinks that had she put a bit more effort into counting, she might have got up to 10,000 species. So even a small garden can be home to a huge number of animals. So let's take a bit of inspiration from Jenny. She shows us a couple of things. Any space can be a great place for insects. We must get better at noticing and preferably recording the wildlife around us so that we can be aware of what works in terms of what we do with our landscapes, what we've got and what we haven't, and whether things are getting better or worse. So there is something in the region of 500,000 hectares of gardens in the UK, and that's more than our area of nature reserves in the UK. And so if every one of us did a little bit more just in our gardens, then we'd have created a network that really would help turn around the fortunes of many insect species. And when we add in allotments, parks, verges, roundabouts, these sorts of things, then it can transform how an insect can move through a city landscape. We've got loads of experience of this already in places like Plymouth and in Exeter, through the work of people like Bug Life and the Exeter Wild City project. Like the guy said earlier on, you know, the council are getting really experienced at this. And there are no real downsides except for the effort required to get out there and get our hands dirty. And grasslands and other habitats can really be created anywhere. So any size, any shape, you know, from a teacup on your patio or whatever to a whole landscape. And I apologise for the shots here from Exeter. We just had some good photos from our Exeter Wild City project. But the point is that kids can do this. You can do it pretty much anywhere. You can create grassland or other habitats, whatever scale. It's a relatively straightforward process. But the key thing, if we want to help insects, is that we don't just do it in one or two places or just in our gardens. We do it at multiple levels, at multiple scales, across landscapes, across our cities. So taking a sort of approach that nature needs to be everywhere, but also a recognition that we do need to focus some effort on some key places. So while everyone out there in our communities can work on their gardens and their local community spaces and the likes, other organisations might want to focus on larger parks or verges or infrastructure or whatever. And this is what we mean by something called a nature recovery network. It's providing that network of features that insects can rely on. So give a little bit more detail on other things that you can do then. So the cheapest and simplest way of helping insects is just to let things grow, really. We have got a terrible tendency in Britain to want to tidy up every last little bit, to prune and cut and shape and chop and trim and mow everything. We do it to our fields, but we also do it to our gardens. And this does several things when we do all this cutting and chopping. It removes nectar sources. It removes things like stems of plants, which many insects bore into for food and shelter. But it also, in the end, it reduces the number of plants that survive in those spaces. So just by letting the grass grow a little, especially through summer, you can feel completely justified in any laziness because you'll have helped nature to thrive. You don't even have to plant wildflowers. You know, obviously planting wildflowers or sowing wildflower seeds is a great thing, but you don't even have to do that. You can just leave it to grow, and things like clovers and daisies and buttercups and self-heal and yarrow and plantains, they'll come up in most gardens and most grasslands. And so if you can leave some areas as well just for a complete year or for most of a season, this will help even more. And we'll end up with nature reserves in everyone's gardens. And even if you don't have your own garden, or if you've got your own garden but you just want to go even further, there are opportunities in Plymouth and elsewhere for joining community groups who are creating wildlife-rich habitats across cities like this. The Green Minds project, which I'll mention a little bit more later on, will be doing lots of this very soon. So everyone can get involved trying to reverse the losses of habitats that we've seen. And obviously I've focused largely on wildflower grasslands here, but you know, there's no reason to let your imagination do anything than run wild. You know, you could create heathlands and wetlands and coastal habitats and orchards and woodlands, because these are all vital components of an insect-rich habitat, and having a diverse mix of habitats is really important. So the next thing we can do is change how we feel about things like weeds. So reimagine weeds, change our perceptions of them, reimagine them as, instead of weeds, let's think of them as wildflowers, because really that's what they are. And strangely, some of the things we consider to be weeds are the most insect-friendly flowers that we have, and they're often reviled and hated for various reasons. They're actually often pioneer plants, so they're ones that come up when there's a change in management or when something isn't quite right with the management. They take advantage of an opportunity. But we often perpetuate the situations for them to grow by constantly over-managing or digging out these things. The best way of getting rid of weeds that I can think of is just to think of them as something other than weeds. Just think of them as wildflowers. Instantly, our weeds have gone. So relax. And then we'll also enable our sort of colder, more concrete parts of our landscape, so in our cities and likes, like the paving in the top picture there, to become places for insects too, rather than places that really don't support them and quite hostile to them. Next thing is around the use of chemicals and the like. So it always baffles me spraying off street trees and other features around our towns and cities. We seem very happy to destroy perfectly good and sort of inobtrusive bits of habitat for something that looks unsightly and doesn't really have any purpose at all, or any apparent purpose. And equally, I mean, I've planted thousands and thousands of trees in my career, and I'm yet to see any need for spraying around newly planted trees. And yet I see this done everywhere, and it results, for the most part, in greater tree mortality. So, you know, more of these trees get affected by the spray than if you just leave them. And yes, you'll get some losses to other things, but it has a far greater impact on the trees. And also in spraying these, of course, you're just creating that open ground, which allows those pioneer species to get started again. And then what do we do to combat them? We go back and spray them again. So it's sort of a perpetual cycle, really. So let's stop doing this. Using herbicides in urban areas is really something we should be able to avoid. And these chemicals, for the most part, aren't nice things to have around in the same places that we live, work, play, and eat. So let's look at alternatives for that. Of course, it's easy to blame others, you know, but we all use pesticides in our gardens and on our drives, and we don't even really think about it. We don't consider what we're doing. We're just trying to go out and do our Saturday or Sunday chores or whatever. And we really need to have a culture change, moving away from pesticides and chemicals. France has shown us that it can be done. There are 5 major cities in France, including Paris, that have banned the use of synthetic pesticides, including in gardens. And if you see aphids or black fly on your favourite plants, the best thing normally to do is to wait. So soon after an infestation starts on plants like this, the cavalry are going to come. Nature has made sure that whenever there's an abundance of food, that there's always something that takes advantage of it. So these ladybirds and earwigs and hoverflies and parasitic wasps, they can come in and start devouring all those aphids and the like. Obviously, we will still have some aphids and black fly, but that just means that our predators, these guys here, can actually survive. And then when they're there next time. But if we spray off, we don't just spray off our target pests, we kill off these guys too. And inevitably, it's the pests that come back quicker. So let's just try and avoid spraying. We need to get a culture change of avoiding spraying. One of the most important things to remember is that there's a huge diversity of insects. We've already said there's 1 million species of insects in the world that we know of. There are many more probably out there that we don't. And they rely on a huge diversity of plants. And by planting the biggest diversity we possibly can, we're likely to support more insects. And especially if you can include you know, native wildflowers. A lot of our host species, a lot of our insects have evolved alongside species that have been here in this country for a long time. So trying to use them would be better, and also trying to think of different colours, shapes and sizes, and to make sure that there are flowers in all seasons. But also try to think of other insects that rely on other things. So keep some piles of wood and leaves and cuttings, and leave some stems on long grasses and other plants through winter. So keeping a mixture is quite good. So a good example here is crickets and grasshoppers. So they'll use tall tussocky grass for shelter in the winter, but also in bad weather and the likes. But then they need the shorter grass to bask, to warm up. So a bit of everything. So that sort of English cottage garden style gardening is a really good thing for insects. And obviously, if there's space either in gardens or in community spaces for flowering trees, these are fantastic, because for metre in area, they have far more flowers on them than you could ever have underneath them. And so flowering limes or apples or crab apples, you can even have potted, you know, fruit trees and flowering trees on patios or whatever, and small shrubs in beds or whatever. And of course, the advantage here is that they also give other benefits. So things like locking up carbon, providing fruit later in the season, both for us, but also for other insects. And of course, they provide shelter and shade. And the final thing for a garden is to provide a place for insects, and particularly solitary bees and the likes, to nest in. So they'll usually use a range of holes and horizontal tunnels and likes, which they either find in sticks or logs or whatever, or they dig in soft ground. So you can do anything with this. So you can drill holes in old unrotted wood, or use stacks of bamboo canes, or you can go to town like this one here that is almost outrageous in how complex it is. And there are even bug hotels with little windows in them, so you can see what's going on. And actually what's going on in there is that they're laying their eggs in with some food, and then the larvae grow inside those tunnels and eventually emerge as adults. So a fascinating thing to watch if you can get one of those. So all these things make a huge difference, but of course 70% of the UK is farmland, producing food for you and me, and the majority of our food is produced in ways that aren't as sensitive to the environment as we'd like. So using pesticides, they compact soils and creating runoff and soil pollution, which affect the insects in our watercourses. So of the 453 water bodies in Devon and Cornwall, not one is considered in good condition, and nearly all have agricultural pollution as one of the causes of that failure. So it's important to recognise the impact that our choices make on the environment, and that can be local environment as well as distant environment, and the impacts that has on insects. So by trying to think about sustainable choices and making those small changes, that can have a huge impact. So firstly, wasting less food obviously means that we don't have to grow as much food, and therefore there's more space for those habitats that support insects. But also look for sustainably farmed options. So it can be difficult to find these, but something like an organic mark means that there are fewer synthetic chemicals used in that, which means those pesticides aren't there damaging insects. There's obviously a controversial elements here about reducing meat consumption, and certainly the evidence supports that. But there's no need to be vegetarian or vegan. I'm too much of a fan of Judney pasties to ever go to either one of them. But but certainly reducing the amount and maybe looking for environmentally sustainable meat and the likes. And of course, we need to shout about these things and tell MPs and councillors and the likes that we feel passionately about it, and maybe to get some bigger changes going on. So as a last point then, I just wanted to mention some of the work that the Green Minds project is doing in Plymouth that will support insects. So this is working in parks across the city, but also in the wider landscape. And we want to encourage people to engage in those places, but also to create habitats and better habitats in those places. And especially from this point of view, for sort of looking to create insect-friendly habitats. And there's loads of ways that you can get involved in the project. And the activities that are going on there. So beyond our gardens and our local community spaces, looking into these bigger spaces will be really valuable. So do get in touch with the project. And I mentioned our thinking on weeds, changing mindsets and the like. So keep an eye out for things like this around the city. We want to help people understand the value of simple things around them that are probably overlooked and certainly undervalued. So start to take notice and enjoy those little things, the little plants and insects around you. And that's a big change. If you can start to notice them, you probably will step around them rather than stepping on them. And Green Minds is also going to look at how alternatives to pesticides can be used in Plymouth. So we're really keen to just sort of trial some of these strange and wonderful alternatives that might help in the future Plymouth to work towards going pesticide free. So looking at things like the top left one there is using electric current to tackle weeds, and particularly this is useful for things like invasive species like Japanese knotweed or the likes. But also other things like the hot foam there, and using a steel brush. We can't have paths getting too slippery with mosses and the likes. So cleaning up is great, but doing it in an insect-friendly way. And it's really important to trial these to get the evidence and the confidence to help local authorities to make these changes. So Green Minds is going to be looking into these, and I hope you'll give them your support and also give feedback, let them know what you feel. So final slide then is just to point in the direction of our Wildlife Trust page with more information. There's several things in there, so you can download the Reversing the Decline of Insects document there, and it has various links, but also there are toolkits that you can use to understand more about what you can do in your garden and your community that go into far more detail, and you can have them to use as reference tools. So that's it from me. Thanks very much, and I guess I'll hand back to Chris for questions.
Thank you very much, Ed. That's yeah, fantastic presentation. Really, okay, hope you can hear me now. I thought I was unmuted, but I wasn't. So yeah, every day's a school day. So thank you, Ed. Fantastic presentation. Really, really, really insightful. I think there's an awful lot of information in there, which I hope everyone's found, valuable. I know there's been definitely some comments coming through on the chat and the Q&A around kind of wanting to share that presentation and kind of, people obviously seeing value in potentially using that elsewhere for their own devices. So there's some really interesting questions coming through. I will do make my best effort to get through those and answer as many of those as we can in the time we've got. So I will just go back. So I'll try to work through it relatively chronologically, because I've made notes as I've gone through, so we can pick them up. So first one, Ed, is a quick one for you, just sort of on the theme of the kind of taking action, what we can all do around this. I know you touched on that in your presentation there, but there is a question about really kind of if you were going to prioritise some of those things, I mean, everyone's situation is different, but the question is, what are the top 3 things that you would recommend for ways we can help insects at home?
Okay, yeah, it's a good point. I think let's start with the simplest. The simplest are generally stopping doing things. So the sort of let it grow idea. If we can all take a Sunday afternoon off from mowing our lawn and actually sit down and enjoy the things buzzing around it, I think that's probably the first thing we could do. But the other thing we could stop doing is spraying things, chemicals onto our driveways and the likes, or using Evergrow or whatever, or whatever chemical you use to help your grass to grow better. That's just stopping the wildflowers coming up through. So those 2 things would probably be the top things that I would suggest. They're easy. They just mean doing less stuff. So get out there and do more of that. And the other thing then is, I guess, is trying to think about creating more wildflowers, but also more other habitats, things like the deadwood and the hedges, and think about how your space, whether that's a garden or a community space, fits into the wider landscape, because understanding that might mean that you realise something that your garden's missing that your neighbour has got. So look around, notice things. That's if we could all notice insects a bit more, we'd probably think a bit more about what they need.
Great. Thank you, Ed. That's yeah, great. It's always nice to get a message to sort of do less to do more. And yeah, in doing so, you can then have more time to notice the insects around you. It's certainly something that we've picked up on this year in Plymouth, and from the work we've been doing in terms of mowing less. It has provided that, and we've had lots of feedback from people about how they've noticed a lot more of that kind of insect life in and around their neighbourhoods, which has been really great to hear. So just picking up on that point, I suppose, from a Plymouth specific point of view, there was a message from a question from Chris Vincent. So it asks, it's great to see that the council are changing their cutting regime throughout the city. With regards to meadow planting, will you be sowing with local native species or letting the species colonise naturally? So in general, this year, what we have done in terms of the additional kind of meadow areas we've created, we have just let those species colonise naturally. It's been amazing what we've seen in certain locations. There's one roadside verge in Prince Rolt which we were monitoring, and it was a very innocuous roadside verge which you wouldn't really pay any attention to in a normal year driving past. But through the flowering season, we've noted over 17 different species of flowering plants, and that including a rare bee orchid. So and we did nothing. We did nothing to that other than just let it grow. And the abundance of insect life and diversity of insect life that was noticeable just through walking through that area. So that is the approach we have taken. I think we've seen great success in that, and we'll be continuing to do so. We will, however, also be, where needed, kind of monitoring and looking where we can enhance some of those sites, where there are areas which we find which maybe are less diverse, and where we've got the opportunity, we will look at approaches to try to bolster the diversity of flowering plants. And then that'll be something which we'll looking to do over a number of years, not something which we're going to do it in one hit, but allow nature to take its course, allow it to rewild in many respects, but when it needs a helping hand, we can give it that and maybe kind of put right some of the previous negative impact we've had, in whether it's building roads and polluting it in certain ways, which means that it's not flourishing. So I hope that answers that question. There's a couple of questions around just sharing of videos and presentations that we've had here today. So certainly, if there'll be a link at the end if you want to get in touch with your contact details of any sharing we can do that after the event. Right. So there was a question, a very good question, I thought. Where is it? So it's about how we get this message out there more widely. So Ed, I'll come across to you. So the question is, how can we get the message out more widely and encourage others to see wildflower areas or weeds as beautiful rather than untidy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So of course, I said earlier, like culturally, we've got this habit, and it is just a habit really of what we think a place should look like, and we've got into this habit and of having mown lawns or grey spaces that we methodically root out every last little weed from every corner of those spaces. And so to change that, we need to have examples of where we have those species in the grasslands and in the grey spaces of our cities and the likes. So the first thing that we can do is just make sure that we have got some places that we can really celebrate. So having them in prominent locations is really good because more people come across them. And then doing things like, obviously you can work with certain audiences, like with schools. So have our schools got weeds growing up through the or wildflowers growing up through the corners of their courtyards, or are the green spaces around the edges of the schools got wildflowers growing in them? Are the hedges with a diverse mix of species there? Then straight away, those children, we can start to build lessons around them, and we can start to build their learning around them. Obviously, talks like this help to get the word out there. So more of these sorts of things, and more maybe celebrating. So the work that I showed of the chalking there by rebel botanists, who I think are involved in the Green Minds work and things of that sort. Then those sort of things are really useful because they're quite subtle. If Banksy went around and drew a great big dandelion on the side of a building and put the Latin word names for that there, then lots of people would celebrate that and would see that as a real bonus. So I think getting people to look down at their feet, getting people to stop and celebrate, but you need to do that by having big prominent messages. We need everybody out there to shout about this and to tell their MPs and their councillors. And I guess one of the other things then is people who can do more, so organisations, whether that's councils or whether it's charities like ourselves, can make sure that we have things like not just informal written stuff on the pavement with chalk, but also more information that people can just readily access. So whether that's sort of through social media, or whether that's through things on television or radio or whatever, but also getting the message out just on the street. So a poster or whatever that celebrates why a verge is left long and is saying what it does to help that space, can tell the people who are right there looking at it what it brings as a value. So for insects, but also those other things, carbon and even things like slowing water down and stuff like that. So it's messaging, it's getting it out there and having sort of, we call it sort of interpretation. So information out there on site in lots of different places, lots of people shouting about it, but just getting to people who also, not always people like us, people who aren't used to hearing this. So perhaps going to a big company who has 1,000 employees and getting them to do something about it. That's another good way of reaching a different audience.
Great, thank you, Ed. Great. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, I think, isn't it, about how we talk to people and also how we talk to people who maybe haven't noticed before, or who haven't had reason to notice before. And certainly in Plymouth this year, there was one thing which we've learned from this year, and we did did communicate what we were doing, but it piqued a lot of interest, from both a positive and negative angle. But the piquing that interest starts a conversation with people, which is really, really fantastic. And we will be, certainly the council going into 2021 will be building on that to make sure we're informing people and kind of building those messages behind that in terms of explaining why we do these things and why it's important in a period of sort of climate and nature emergency to kind of be thinking and acting in this way.
Can I just add something there, Chris? Because I think it's really important as well that from a council's perspective, if we have advocates who can sort of point out the positive things that the council is doing, it means so much more than the council saying what they're doing themselves. So, to give you an example, if I tweet something like, oh, let's just say we are not going to, I don't know, take the weeds away from a certain area of the city, we're going to let it rewild, I'll get the message back, oh, that's because you haven't got the money and you can't be bothered to do that. Rather than the real reason is because we're trying to increase the diversity of wildflowers so that we can have more insects. And I do think that advocacy of interested partners across the city supporting that wider messaging is really, really important.
Can I just add to that as well that the language is really important there as well. So even just when we talk about these things, let's avoid using terms like weeds and let's celebrate them as wildflowers. And straight away, we're just not using that sort of negative, and hopefully that helps other people to see that the benefits that they might bring.
Fantastic, thank you. Just got a couple of minutes left on the Q&A. So now at that very difficult point of trying to pick out which ones we cover in the kind of couple of minutes we have. So there's more that we can get through. There was an interesting one actually I was thinking about, because I think we can talk about the positives, but there are obviously the challenges involved in this, which I think may be worth touching on. Just one that pops out very quickly, a very simple one, and Ed, you may have a particular answer to this. So there are conflicts, aren't there? For example, allotment holes or people growing vegetables, insects can be a pest to them. So one particular question was around any ideas on black fly larvae. How can we control black fly larvae when they're eating your broad beans? But if there's anything from a wildlife trust angle you had around kind of like pest management in vegetable growing areas.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I touched on it in the talk there, but I mean, it's so first of all, we often jump straight to the spray, whether that's soap and water or whether that's beer for slugs or whatever it might be for other things. So the first thing is I would say stop, and quite often, as I said earlier, when you start to get a lot of pests, for want of a better word, black fly and the likes, then you will get other things come in, and there's a bit of patience there. So it is a challenge. I know I constantly fail at vegetable growing, and I do lose some things too. I had no end of broccoli lost to cabbage whites not that long ago, and it is sort of soul destroying. So obviously you can sort of use things like netting and the likes for butterflies and caterpillars. For black fly, I think really you can obviously do things like wiping leaves, just wiping them off. So that's the old-fashioned way of dealing with them. But then also creating the homes for other things.